Did any of you have teachers that inspired you?
I remember one, they're all totally different than me, but there were certainly some spectacular ones. I remember one person who was a magnificent lecturer. And 4 years after his lecture on the Pazzi conspiracy during the Renaissance, I went to the cathedral in Florence and could walk around the room and remember where things were, from 4 years. It was brilliant. Another person talked rapidly, as fast as you could, and we were writing down like crazy. He would leave the room for a break, and 20 minutes later, students would still be writing things down because it was so logically presented and so clear. And yet I would never do any of those things in my class today. I teach in a totally different way, but it was a different era, but I certainly had people that inspired me with how much they cared about whether I learned or not.
Yeah.
Certainly I found that the inspiration came from the one-on-one relationships. I never felt that there was a performance by a lecturer on a lectern that captivated me and kept me wanting to hear more. It was the one-on-one interpersonal connections, and I think I wouldn't be here today as a historian without those interventions. And I think that does speak to the broader issue of why we all love teaching. It's that power to transform people, that transformative effect.
I think we remember the passion that some of our teachers had, and their integrity and their values and their convictions. These are the things that I remember more about their personalities in a strange kind of way. Not that I ever agreed with any of them.
I think that's right. I would agree with that in a way. I think for me it was something about, I remember when I was an undergraduate and when I was in the first year, and it wasn't a one-to-one connection because the person didn't, I don't think I had tutors, they gave lectures and they were fairly normal, ordinary lectures, but somehow those lectures made a connection with me at that stage that I was at. And the connection that they made was that for them, history was a sort of form of political activism, if you like. And somehow that resonated with me. And I think the people who influenced me after that, people I'll say as writers like Edward Thompson, displayed that same sort of approach and attitude and a sort of empathy with people in the past and not dominant groups that held a sort of attraction to me. So it was both an emotional thing but also an intellectual and an identity thing. It's hard to separate those out.
Leah, have you got anything that you would...
Well, I want to pick up on Alan's point about identity with people in the past, because I think that's a particularly powerful feeling. The great teachers actually do conjure up another world, and they allow you to travel through time. And it's a kind of a magical process. Certainly that was something that I wanted to learn how to do.
Geoff?
For me, it's about teaching approach as much as anything else, I think, in terms of inspiration. When I was an undergraduate, I'm going back a long way now, this is way back in the last century, as I keep saying, I was taught by a fairly standard set of lectures and seminars, and the seminars were discussion seminars, essentially. And then I went into my education year, into teacher training, and for the first time I was allowed to do a project. It was a group project. We engaged with primary evidence. And really, the whole thing was tremendously exciting, and I got a publication out of it, and all that sort of stuff. But for me, it then brought into focus a problem I've been grappling with, I think, ever since. That lectures and seminars, I think, have an important role to play in our teaching, but then so too does the more experiential type of learning as well. And what's the balance between them? From the point of view of an individual student, how far do we go along the road of experiential learning? Because we can't be entirely, I don't think, going along that particular route, but do we go far enough? And how does that relate to issues that some of you know sort of beset me, the notion of progression? Do we increasingly get them to be experiential as they go through our courses, as I think probably I've been trying to do? Not just with dissertation work, that's the obvious one, but with other types of work they might be doing as well.
So that's sort of how much scaffolding you offer them, in a sense, at particular stages, isn't it?
Yeah. So but it's a guidance. Sorry, it's a guidance type of teaching, isn't it? As much as anything else that's important.
And it doesn't necessarily rely on performance.
No, not at all.
In fact, I think the most important moments for me were not in class at all. There were interactions with faculty outside in the place we ate, and things like that. Sitting down for coffee with someone at a table, that made the difference. Because I think the two things, you said integrity, I think that's real important. And there were two things. They had to take what they were doing seriously and clearly care about it deeply. And they had to care about whether I learned.
And that's infectious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a sense, that seems to me not to come from the techniques that they use. Those almost don't matter. It actually comes from them and who they are.
You can't fake it because the students smell the rat within minutes, I would say. If you're lucky, you might be able to fake it for a few days or a few weeks. But if they don't believe that you have an absolute integrity about your subject and their learning, well, I don't think you should be in the job.
And I mean, I think that's interesting because for me, a lot of that integrity came from the fact that they were practitioners in their discipline. And I mean, obviously, as an undergraduate in Australia, I did a wide variety of courses. But what captivated me and what it allowed me to engage with them, I mean, I was just ruminating a little bit. Actually, it was probably my high school history teachers who inspired me more than my university teachers. But the difference then when I got to university, coming back to Paul's issue about integrity, was they were practitioners. They were out there doing this. They were talking about their own research, and that was the really amazing thing. And so I tended not to construct them in my own mind as teachers. I constructed them as historians or scholars of English literature or philosophers. And that to me was the amazing thing. Wow, what a wonderful thing these guys do. They're sharing with us this incredible knowledge that they've gone out into the world and helped create.
Was it, in a sense, the fact that they were professors who were involved in scholarship, or was it something about them as people?
Well, of course, in those days, the vast majority of them weren't professors. They were just lecturers. But it was, I mean, it was the fact that they were engaged in what they were talking about. I mean, that was the wonderful thing, being in a lecture. I mean, one of the lecturers I had, he was not a fantastic lecturer, but his name was Alfred W. McCoy, and he was a historian of Filipino history. And if you've read anything about Filipino history, the fall of the Marcos regime, in part, has to do with Alfred W. McCoy essentially pilfering a document out of American archives that showed that Marcos's war record was false. So you're in this class where you were reading, significant textbooks, and your teacher's name was appearing in it. And that again, he was a very idiosyncratic teacher, but the very fact that we saw his work as a historian in our learning, I just found very, very powerful.
How does all this compare to the Puerto Rican situation? Because we've got two cultural contexts going here. Let's bring in a third one, Arlene.
Well, in terms of people who inspire me, I would say that in high school I had a literature teacher who, for example, we would study Don Quixote, and she would always apply the story of Don Quixote to our reality. So this connection, this idea that I could live Don Quixote, but I could live my life through it as well, and that it could give me a guidance through life, that really inspired me dearly, that teacher. But also in Puerto Rico, I was studying at a time when this new generation of professional historians were rewriting the history of Puerto Rico, making a relevant history of us. So for us to do history was a political act of bringing the people who had been silenced by the official histories. And that action was really what inspired me to become a historian and a teacher.
There seems to be missing out of this, though, the notion of these great figures not only being inspiration in the sense that they've achieved greatness, as it were, in whatever context as historians, but whether they also are interested in the student as individuals and the student's needs and ambitions. And it seems to me, I mean, I've met lots of lecturers I've come across in the past who I've listened to, and some have been former colleagues, I should say, but their engagement beyond themselves, I think, was extraordinarily limited. I think it was about them and not about the students they were teaching. And it seems to me you can't teach unless you start off from the point of view of being interested in the students and what the students' issues and problems are and what the students' ambitions are.